Good afternoon, everyone. It goes without saying that 2016 has been a really odd year so far. Donald Trump is the Republican nominee, pop legend David Bowie is dead, and the FARC peace deal recently has been rejected. And of course, the Brexit happened. Originally, many pundits derided Brexit as a short-sighted and misguided movement that was quickly dismissed as not going to happen. Yet I distinctly remember, a few months ago, sitting in Japan at the time, studying abroad, when suddenly my little BBC news ticker went off saying, Britain has voted to leave the EU. And it came as a shock to all of us. It also came as a shock to my wallet, as the ensuing market chaos made the yen suddenly appreciate a lot, and I could not withdraw as much at the local ATM. So, given that Brexit has happened, this leaves a lot of questions of what does this mean for the EU, what does this mean for Britain, and what does this mean for a variety of different issues? Well, here at the Tower Center Student Forum, we like to combine practitioners with academia, and we have two distinct individuals here today to give us a taste of that. So, our first speaker, friend of Tower Center, and professor of government at the University of Texas at Dallas, is Dr. Harold Clarke. Clarke's research focuses on electoral choice and the political economy of party support in Great Britain. He is the editor of the Journal of Electoral Studies and recently published Affluence, Austerity, and Electoral Change in Britain back in 2013. Our second speaker, Dr. Lorinc Redei, is a lecturer at the LBJ School of Public Affairs and earned his PhD in International Relations at Central European University in Budapest. Dr. Redei has political experience from working within the institutions of the EU from 2005 to 2008 as a press officer at the European Parliament, primarily focusing on the work of the Foreign Affairs Committee. He returned to Brussels in 2011 to handle Hungarian language press and communications for the European Parliament during Hungary's 6-month presidency of the European Council. Here at the Tower Center, like I said, we like to combine academics with practitioners, and I think these two will give us a very enlightening discussion today. With that, I shall hand it off to Dr. Clarke. Let's give him a round of applause for being here today.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here at SMU, at the Tower Center. Always enjoy these events, and today I'm looking forward to speaking with you and about Brexit, of course. And I'm going to focus on largely the politics and the public opinion, if you will, and that led to the Brexit decision. And then we will get more of an EU perspective, a different kind of perspective on the Brexit from our next speaker. That's me. Some background to the Brexit decision. This is something that has been a long time coming. Great Britain, and in fact, this is not the first referendum on continued EU membership. As some in our audience, not the students, they'll be far too young to remember anything prior to 1990, I'm sure. But some of us will recognize that back in 1975, the UK had a referendum on continuing membership in what was then called the European Community. And at that time, they voted to stay by a very large margin, 2-1. 2-1, but still, 1/3 is indicative of substantial Euroscepticism. And I think in terms of understanding the train of events that led to the Leave vote on June the 23rd of this year, we have to remember that there's always been a relatively strong current of Euroscepticism in British public opinion, UK public opinion, particularly within the Conservative Party. But not only in the Conservative Party. You will, back in the 70s, indeed, one might argue that it was largely in the amongst supporters of the Labour Party. But over the years, that shifted, and particularly in the 1990s, after the signing of the Maastricht Treaty. In many ways, Maastricht can be demarcated as a very significant intervention, because Maastricht made clear that the European project was indeed very much a political project. and not simply a free trade kind of project such as we see with things such as NAFTA and so forth. The ambitions of Europe were much, much greater. And indeed, when opponents of the EU argued that what was at stake was whether Britain would become part of a European superstate, quote unquote, this was really, there's a considerable amount of truth to this. There's a considerable amount of truth to this. That the European project is very much a political project. Whether you like it or not, and there are all sorts of different dimensions to it, but it's at that point that Euroscepticism began to grow in strength and intensity amongst individuals and in breadth, particularly within the Conservative Party. And for a while, most Eurosceptics were in the 1990s and early 2000s were within the Conservative Party, voicing a minority view. But some people decided that they would never be successful in extricating the UK from the European Union unless they formed their own political movement. And the key political movement was the United Kingdom Independence Party, or UKIP, which was founded quite a long time ago now, back in 1993. But about 2010, just shortly after the Great Recession had really got going in the UK, and just about the time of the 2010 election, UKIP really took off in terms of support. And that support continued to grow during the ensuing Eurozone crisis. And the growth of UKIP is really important because what it did ultimately was to frighten establishment conservatives, particularly Prime Minister David Cameron. And I think it's quite arguable to say no UKIP, no referendum, no Brexit. The other thing to appreciate very early on is that there has been great volatility, very substantial volatility in public opinion about membership in the European Union. We've been doing monthly surveys with the company YouGov, which is a prominent survey research company in Great Britain and the United States and around the world, really. We're doing a study in Hong Kong with them right now, as well as projects in Germany and France and so forth. And one of the things with our British public opinion data that you see here is just an enormous amount of volatility in public attitudes. And that suggests in turn that if we want to understand the Brexit decision on June 23rd, it can't be understood simply in terms of demographic divisions in the electorate, long-term national identities, etc., etc. Rather, there are a lot more proximate forces at work which produced that majority that we saw on June 23rd for Leave. Also, you can see this volatility reflected in voting intention responses to public opinion polls. There were a lot of polls. In the old days, you used to be lucky to get one Gallup poll a month. I'm old enough to remember that. Now, though, we have just a plethora of polls, and if you take a look at the divisions of public opinion in terms of vote intentions to leave or stay, since 2010 through to June 2016, there are various ways to analyze these. This particular way here, I'm afraid to punch any other button here because I'm afraid I'm going to.
There should be a pointer on there somewhere.
Yeah, whether there's a pointer here or not. Is there a pointer?
You should be. I see a little.
I don't know if that's which one is the pointer. Let's make sure we get it right. Do you know which one's the pointer? This one on this side?
I don't know.
I don't know either. Does anybody know which one's the pointer?
No.
I'll point. I'll make it the pointer. There we are. There we are. Using this methodology, on June 22nd, within 24 hours of the vote, we have the Blues, which are not the Democrats in this case, or the Reds, the Republicans, but rather Remain and Leave, with a 2-point lead for Remain. And if we'd done that a day earlier, we would have basically had the opposite, okay? So this is a really closely fought thing, as I say, and there's a lot of arguments to be made that short-term forces were very important for producing the decision that we ended up with. There's what the decision was. Here's the UK, 51.9 to leave. England, 53.4. Wales, 52.5. But take a look at Scotland and Northern Ireland. Scotland, of course, had just had a referendum in September 2014, as a number of you will know, on whether they should remain part of the UK. And a week before that event, there was actually, the polls were showing a majority to leave. But in the end, it didn't quite happen. But there's substantial nationalist sentiment in Scotland, and a very pro-EU sentiment as well. That is shared in Ireland as well, as we see in the Northern Ireland numbers. But of course, those two countries, quote unquote, as they're referred to amongst UK social scientists, have relatively small populations. And as it turns out, Scotland had quite a low turnout as well relative to the rest of the UK. And so in the end, here we are with a Leave majority. And of course, on June the 24th, the world ended. Okay. In case so you really aren't here this afternoon. There's some details on our I'm going to show you some results from our 3-wave national survey that we conducted with YouGov to study voting behavior in the referendum. What forces were at work then? You say short-term forces, more proximate kinds of things at work. Well, people there's first of all who voted to leave. This is interesting as well. Before we go to that, just quickly, the demographics. And this stuff's easy to study. Like a lot of media guys commented on this quite heavily, perhaps too heavily, as it turns out. But you can see there's a big age gradient. People like the students in this room, they all voted to remain if they voted, and people in higher social grades. This is a standard British market research classification of social class. We're very much in favor of remain, whereas people further down the socioeconomic ladder, the C2s, the Ds and Es, the manual workers, if you will, or the unemployed in many cases, were very heavily in favor of Leave, okay? And with the upper group here voting to remain. Here's your elites, okay? Here's your populism, your populist division. This is what Donald Trump complains about, but that's another talk. Notice no gender difference at all, none. Interesting, actually, none at all. But that's this is what people have talked about in the press. Why? Because this stuff is usually published as part of the public opinion polls that the survey houses put out. They put out crosstabs that look like you can derive this information. But this isn't really the story, as I said. The story has to do with much more proximate kinds of things in terms of understanding what's going on. People who study referendums, myself and others, typically focus on 3 things. One is cost-benefit calculations. The second is what we call cues or heuristics, paying attention to what the messenger says, not the message, but the messenger. And there are good reasons to believe that's true. Then also paying attention to some longer-term kinds of forces in big referenda like this, what I call polity-shaping referenda. Questions of national, supranational, and subnational identities coming into play, and then also recognizing that not everything is cognitive. Emotions are important. They're important here in terms of the cues or heuristics. They're important in terms of risk perceptions. They're important in a lot of ways. And if we're to understand the sentiments like driving, what's driving Leave, the emotional side, I would argue, is quite important indeed. Won't run through a lot of numbers. Let me talk to you a little about how the campaign set up. The BBC has had, you may be able to get this on their website for the BBC. They've got a great post-mortem on Brexit. And they interviewed, one of the things they did was to interview the guys who led the campaigns, the backroom people who led the campaigns. And the person who organized, and then, drove the Remain campaign, said, well, we had a meeting. We knew this is coming up for very, shortly. David Cameron said we're going to have one before the end of 2017. So we thought last year in July we should meet in London and get going because this thing's coming up. And so they assembled in a room, perhaps not dissimilar to this. And that person, she started off and she said to her colleagues, well, let's think for a few minutes about the good things we can tell the voters about being part of the EU. Nothing. She said, I sat for a minute and a half. Total silence. So what they decided to do, the default position, was to talk about the costs of leaving. The bad things that would happen to you if you left. And so the ensuing Remain campaign, as it evolved, became known as Project Fear, led by David Cameron and his ally, the Prince of Pain, George Osborne, the architect of austerity, the Prince of Pain. What these guys did was to try to scare, quote unquote, the bejesus out of the voters about the economic crash which was going to ensue within minutes after the votes were tallied. Now, they didn't just rely upon their own voices, rather they rented a jet from Davos, and they brought in the A-list. They brought in Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF. Closer to home, they had Mark Carney, the ostensibly neutral head of the Bank of England.
And one of your fellow Canadians, I mean.
That's right, and a fellow Canadian, formerly head of the Bank of Canada, and so forth. But they brought in the Prime Minister of Sweden. And of course, most famously, they brought in Barack Obama. And Barack Obama not only talked about the costs, he also threatened the electorate. He says, look, if you guys don't, we're going to put you at the back of the queue. Not only are you going to lose money from getting out of Europe, you won't be able to make it back by making a trade deal with the U.S. We're going to put you at the back of the queue. And that, as it turns out, was the latter part of his talk was not smart, okay? He's famous for saying about international affairs, I try not to do stupid stuff. That was stupid stuff, okay? This was not smart. To say to any Brits, regardless of their position, that we're going to put you at the back of the queue is not a smart thing to do. However, they didn't just stop there. They also got celebrities. They had David Beckham, Bend It Like Beckham, involved. They had they had Bob Geldof, the Boomtown Rat. They had him going up and down the Thames. They did everything. They pulled out all the stops, and the message was the same: negative, doom, gloom, terrible things. Now, that was the Remain campaign. The Leave campaign, and it was very effective, by the way. Don't let it, just because they didn't get a majority, it turns out the single most important factor were economic, perceived economic costs, okay? So that, it worked, it just wasn't enough, okay? On the Leave side was pretty negative too. But what they were saying was, we're going to drown in a sea of immigrants, of foreigners, quote unquote. And the EU will not give way on the free movement of people, with the free labor market in the European Union. And they said, hey, look, David Cameron promised us like substantial controls here, and he went and talked to Angela Merkel and he got nothing. He came back with nothing. And this is just like we've been telling you, as Nigel Farage, the head of UKIP, said, I've been telling you this for 20 years, that we have no option. We must leave. We will be drowned in a sea of foreigners. We will lose our sovereignty. We're going to lose our democracy. We're going to lose our culture. We're going to be threatened by terrorists. just like what's happening in Brussels and Paris, and this is going to happen in London. And so they had their own version of Project Fear on the other side. And it too was very effective at the level of the individual voter. So you had these two closely related factors, cost factors, driving the vote. And they were both very, very important. Closely related to this, I'll jump right on through here, all these fancy numbers, right to this one right here. Closely related to this, of course, were perceptions of the risks. Because it's not just benefits and costs, it's how likely these things are to actually occur. Right? Like an expected utility. I see Bud Weinstein here, he'll tell us about expected utility models and so on. Spent a career doing that. Risk perceptions were very important. Emotions were, all the stuff we said worked, the individual level, but also what worked, and I want to draw your attention to it. This is approximate stuff, okay? This is the contingent stuff that historians say years from now will make modest livings from speculating about. These are the common room counterfactuals, as I call them, and there are two of them here: Nigel Farage, and secondly Boris Johnson. Nigel, as I said, is the leader of the UKIP party. Been around for a long time in British politics. He's actually a member of the European Parliament, ironically, and he is he's a very influential politician in Britain in terms of moving public opinion and voting behavior. The problem is the distribution of opinion upon him is very negative, okay? So if you only got Nigel out running your campaign, that's it. That's it. The argument is, that's great. There are some people who love him. They fancy Nigel, as the Brits say, and that's what drives their vote. Unfortunately, they're only about 25 to 30% of the electorate at most, okay? So where's the rest of the heuristic come from, the leader heuristic, the campaign leader? So it's Boris Johnson. Okay? So the Leave, and who's Boris? Does anybody know who Boris is?
He's now the foreign minister.
That's right. And who does he look like? Donald Trump, right? He's got orange hair. He was even born in New York, and there are some birther stories out there about him, that are very interesting. That they're actually brothers.
He was the colorful mayor of London.
That's right. He was, and so Boris here, very prominent conservative politician, Eurosceptic, as he announces on the 21st of February, the day after David Cameron announces we're going to have the referendum. When David, Dodgy Dave goes out there and tells the press, this is when we're going to have our referendum. Well, here's one of the really big deals in the Conservative Party, who hasn't announced what he's going to do, right? But comes out the next day after the referendum's announced and said, well, I got a conscience, I got to vote Leave.
Had he ever commented on Brexit before that?
Oh, he'd commented, but he'd always played it close to the vest.
Yep.
And he's like, he plays it close to the vest. But the assumption, and probably the most surprised man in the world when Boris said this, was David Cameron. Right. Because this guy is the most popular politician in Britain, okay? And so he doesn't just say, well, I'm going to do that and then go back to his home in Surrey or whatever and sit there, or take his bicycle back to his flat in London. He's famous for riding this bike. No, he becomes the leader of the Leave campaign. So they got this two-headed campaign going. They got the guys who in pubs, and the guys who maybe fight outside pubs. For Nigel's leading that crowd. Then they've got Boris leading the polite side. Okay, and so we've done some analyses and all sorts of numbers. But was it Boris what done it? Well, Nigel himself said so in the BBC postmortem I talked about. He said, I could never appeal to those toffs down in Surrey, but our friend Boris could, and we can make a good argument for that. Last thing I'm going to say, so no Boris, no Brexit. Plausible conjecture, okay? That's the difference between 51 and 48. The other thing, just the last thing, is in the wake of the Leave majority, the next day, all the polite people like ourselves, all those journalists like Polly Toynbee and all these people with The Guardian and so on, came out and they trashed the electorate. They just trashed the electorate. The voters are fools. referendums are terrible. We should never. I bet you if there'd been a Remain majority, they wouldn't have said this. Did they suddenly just discover this? And they said one other thing, though, that's a claim that's actually that we can address empirically. They said, well, if everybody had voted, you know, within the electorate as a whole, there's a clear Remain majority. And I said, well, let's see how likely that is. So we did. So we used our survey evidence, and that's what we come up with is with a point estimate, 50.35% Remain. Okay, but survey data, got to respect those confidence intervals. You guys remember studying this in intro stat?
You told me this.
Yes, that's right. Did you remember it? Well, here it is again. Okay, so there's the range. We don't know. If you view this a little differently, the odds of a Remain majority are almost 2 to 1, but it's not a lead pipe cinch. But if you are of a populist persuasion, the reaction of the elites, the media elites in particular, and to what happened is just breathtaking. It really is. Left, right, and center, they just trashed the voters, and so you know, there we are. That's what drove it. Short-term forces, a lot of contingent stuff, very negative campaign. All this stuff works just the way professors say it does. No Boris, no Brexit? Very possibly. Very possibly. Let me start at this point. I've probably gone a little longer than I should. And this is it. This is the story of voting, okay? Last point. We just did a survey. Jim and I are thinking of working on a project, hoping to work on a project together. And I asked my friends at YouGov to run surveys in Great Britain and in France and Germany for us, taking a look at attitudes towards immigration and attitudes towards the EU. With regard to the EU, there's been a lot of discussion of remorse, like post-Brexit remorse. No. The distribution of opinion is almost identical to what we see here. It hasn't shifted in the aggregate since June the 23rd. What about immigration? Well, the interesting thing there is not that Brits are negative about immigration. This has been a valence issue for a long time, and they are overwhelmingly negative. The interesting thing is in France and Germany is the negativity that we picked up in those surveys too. So maybe this is not the last exit, okay? So let me stop at this point.
Thanks, Harold.
I'm sorry I ran out. Yes, take care, my friend.
I have to go catch a plane to Paris.
Oh, break my heart. My goodness.
Have a safe trip.
All right. Is there a way to actually just turn this off?
Yeah, we'll see if we can turn it off.
Those aren't my conclusions. I don't want you to get the wrong idea. No. So thank you, first of all, to the Tower Center for inviting us. I think this is going to be a great conversation. It's a pleasure to be here. Harold spoke very eloquently about sort of the autopsy of why Brexit happened, focusing on UK politics, and I think that's great because what I want to talk about is looking at it from an EU perspective, and then we can put it together in the Q&A. So I think the one thing that we both really agree on, and we didn't talk before we met today, so it's not like this was planned, is that you can't tell this entire Brexit story if you're just looking at cost-benefit analyses and thinking of, oh, how much does it cost in the EU, how much does it cost to leave the EU? It has all to do with politics, with immigration, with identity, with these leaders, right, with all these kinds of things. So because Harold talked so much about the UK, I don't really want to, I have some notes about what I think happened in the UK, but I think we've covered that very well. The only thing I'd add to this is that you also need to realize that the UK media is something that you really need to take into account when you're talking about the EU. So in the UK, within Europe, it's in the UK where most daily newspapers are sold. A very large proportion of the population reads daily newspapers. And a large majority of those newspapers are violently anti-European, right? And this is actually a big this was a big factor also, I think, in the campaign, so that's something to sort of add on. But what I want to talk about is that is what happens now, right? So the Brits voted. This is the outcome that we got. So what are the politics of the upcoming UK-EU negotiations? about the Brexit. And then the second point that I want to make is sort of what's the political fallout of Brexit for the EU as a whole going forward in the sort of medium term. Okay. So in terms of the upcoming negotiations between the UK and the EU, I think the thing to realize, right, is that here the positions of the EU and the UK are also extremely political, right? So Theresa May just last week or 10 days ago, whenever it was, announced that she's going to trigger this Article 20, meaning she's going to start these proceedings to leave the EU by the end of March. So if that happens, then we have a 2-year window during which these what people have been calling divorce proceedings, right, need to take place. And during the Q&A, we can get into a little bit more detail about what those divorce proceedings are. But the point I want to make right now is that it's going to be a clash of politics, not economics. Okay. And to start with the UK government especially faces a very tough choice at this point, right? Because the entire Brexit campaign, as Harold talked about, was based on this idea that the UK wants to regain sovereignty, and especially sovereignty over its borders in terms of immigration, right? So that's the main promise of Brexit to the supporters of Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage. That's why they voted for this, at least in large part. So what can the UK government do? Well, it sort of has two options, and we can, in the Q&A, I can tell you why the third option that they think they have is not an option. They have two options. One, essentially stay within the single market and accept the free movement of people, just like they did before. But at that point, rightfully so, everybody's going to say, okay, well, in essence, you've just stayed part of the EU, except now you don't get to participate in the decision-making process. So this is even worse of a situation than we were in before, right? So if you accept the single market and the free movement of people, that's politically a very tough position for the UK government to put itself in. On the other hand, you can say, no, we want to regain our sovereignty, we want to regain control of our borders, we want to be able to limit immigration, we want to be able to limit social services to Eastern Europeans who are working here, etc. That means that the UK is going to need to take either completely the single market or stay in only with a little toe, right? And that's going to have big economic costs. So then again, the UK government is going to be a very tight spot where all these sort of Brexit promises, oh, we're going to put all this extra money into the National Health Service, all this stuff from which they've already tried to distance themselves, it's going to become clear that that was a no-go, right? So either way, I think no matter what happens after the UK-EU negotiations, the UK government is going to be extremely unpopular at home. Very unpopular. And I think what's interesting about this is that this essentially means that the Tories are going to be a very unpopular party in about 2.5 years when they finish these negotiations. And the entire reason that this whole Brexit thing happened was because the Tories, David Cameron, needed to shore up his own party. That's why this whole referendum happened, right? Because of the threat of UKIP, the threat of Boris Johnson, right? So the whole idea of, oh, we're going to save the Conservative Party, I think is totally backfired, right? Which is why I think, speaking of historians who are going to make their livings afterwards, David Cameron is going to be the sort of poster child for the most feckless, ineffective prime minister in the UK since in the post-war era, right? So that's going to be interesting to watch. So how about on the EU side? And this is what I want to spend most of my time talking about. Well, I think one of the things that Harold said, right, is that a lot of times we're thinking about this in terms of rational ideas, right? But emotions play a big role as well. And this actually holds true for the EU as well. And I think what the British government has never understood is how much the rest of Europe hates it. And this is something that I can talk about with quite a high confidence. If you look at all the statements being made by the French foreign minister, the German foreign minister, the German chancellor, the French prime minister, the head of the European Commission, the president of the European Council, pretty much anybody in the European Parliament, right? They have had enough of the UK having these special deals, always moaning about how they want their money back, always trying to get sort of, special dispensations for, the euro, for Schengen, for all these other things, right? There's no goodwill left in Europe towards the UK. Okay, So because of that, already these negotiations are starting, right? In an environment where there's no goodwill towards the UK. They're also particularly ticked off right now because the EU would have a lot of other stuff to deal with right now other than this Brexit, right? There's the Greek financial crisis, which you guys don't hear about, but that's only because it's been swept under the rug. Nothing is solved there, right? That's just going to come up again in a few years. There's the migration crisis, which however you feel about whether this is really a huge problem or if on a European level this is solvable, it's still something that the Europeans need to deal with, right? And it needs to be dealt with at a European level because clearly on a national level you can't deal with it because it's not working, right? You have just general, youth unemployment in southern Europe that's in places above 50%, right? Like there's stuff that the Europeans need to deal with. And the last thing they wanted was this self-inflicted problem of, for the next 2 years, spending all of their time negotiating Britain's exit from the EU, right? So this is making the UK even more unpopular, right? And so for these reasons, I think the EU is going to drive a very, very hard bargain. And there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, they actually, despite what the UK government says, it's the EU that holds most of the cards. The way that this works is that as soon as the UK officially, apparently at the end of March, is going to say, no, we want out, we're going to start a little kitchen timer set for 2 years. If there's no agreement between the EU and the UK on what this divorce is going to look like, the UK is just booted out after 2 years automatically, right? And all of the EU regulations that apply to it are gone, all the EU benefits that are coming to it are gone, all its cooperation with all sorts of EU programs in terms of common research programs, in terms of the Erasmus program, of students studying abroad, all this kind of stuff is essentially put aside, right? So the EU really has all the cards. The second thing is that there's a very, very strong reason why the rest of Europe is going to resist giving the UK a special deal, right? Which is that as soon as Europe says, okay, you know what, UK, you can stay sort of part of the single market, but not have these obligations that go along with it. As soon as they open that Pandora's box, all the other 27 member states of the EU are going to say, oh, me too. I want to be able to be in the single market, but not have any Muslims come in. Or I want to be part of the single market, but I don't want to have to pay agricultural funds. I want to be in the single market, but I actually don't want all the environmental regulations that go along with it. Everybody's going to say, oh, me. I want a little special deal as well, right? And this is mutually assured destruction, right? 27 of those member states are sitting around. Everybody has in their own pocket, this is how I want to redo the whole EU bargain, right? So nobody's going to want to open up that can of worms, right? So there's a very strong structural reason why the UK is unlikely to get a special deal, right? Because that would mean a bunch of other states also want special deals. And then the final thing, and this gets also to something that Harold talked about, right? That it's very difficult to show why the EU is a good thing, right? David Cameron couldn't come up with a good idea of, hey, this is how you benefit from this is how you benefit from Europe, right? And that's because a lot of the benefits, right, are very sort of hard to see and spread around, and people have taken them for granted, right? So the fact that all Brits can just get on a Ryanair flight and for 40 euros go to Spain, no passport, go backpacking around Europe and not have to change currencies and therefore lose money, that all of these agricultural imports from Spain and Portugal, their oranges and whatever, are much cheaper than if tariffs were in place, right? These are on the margin things, right? Like oranges are maybe 10 pence cheaper than they would be. Over a lifetime, that's a huge gain, right? But it's very hard to communicate that. So the European Union and its institutions have always had a really hard time communicating why the EU is a good thing, right? And they've also had a very hard time communicating why it would be a bad thing to leave the EU. And this in the sort of jargon in Brussels is called the cost of non-Europe, right? So it's very hard to say, okay, what are going to be the exact costs of leaving the EU, right? Well, this is a golden opportunity. So for all of the EU institutions that are invested here, for instance, the European Parliament and the European Commission, but also all of those governments who really do want to keep the EU functioning for a long time, this is the perfect example to show, okay, let's just see what happens when somebody leaves the EU. And then I want to see in 5 years whether there's a line out the door saying, oh, we want out as well. Let's see if 5 years of a recession in the UK and the entire city of London moving to Frankfurt is a great thing, right? Let's see if the pound, which is currently at a 31-year low against the dollar, if that's a great thing, right? So I think there's also this idea in the EU's mind that this is a golden opportunity to show what great of a cost it actually has when you leave the EU. And you don't get these kinds of opportunities very often, right? Because nobody has ever left the EU before, right? There's sort of the Greenland example, but it's the student population of UT Austin is the same as Greenland, seriously, right? So, and it wasn't a sovereign country, and it doesn't actually have an economy, just fishes, right? Like that's basically, right? So that's, people talk about Greenland, don't worry about it. That's really not an equivalent idea, right? So the EU has very good reasons to be very stubborn and to drive a very, very hard bargain, right? So I think you're gonna see that over the next 2 years, and it's mostly for political reasons, not for Don't think about this having to do with the relative exports and imports and the trade relationship and all of that. That's actually secondary. This is for political reasons. So the second main point I want to make is that the Brexit is also going to have serious political fallout in Europe for the sort of medium term. So not just for the next 2 years when these negotiations are going on, but in the long term. And I think this is actually the more troubling and the more important point that I want you guys to understand. And the reason I think that's true is because the Brexit example just introduces this idea that some academics have been talking about, but mostly you haven't seen in actual politics, which is EU disintegration, right? So up until now, everybody has been talking about EU integration, right? And nobody has really seriously talked about EU disintegration, right? And this is for several reasons. First, because no country has left the EU before, right? So geographically, if you look at the EU and the way it's evolved, it's constantly growing, right? Sometimes it stays the same, but then it grows, and then it stays the same, and then it grows, right? It's never gotten smaller. Again, taking Greenland aside. So Brexit would be the first time that you have a geographical reduction of the EU, right? But more importantly, the EU's history has also been one of functional integration, meaning more and more powers that are devolved or sort of evolved to the European level, right? So the way that this is usually described is sort of a graph that goes like this, right? It doesn't go straight up all the time, right? Sometimes there are times when it stagnates and nothing really happens in EU integration, right? So when all the academics get really upset, maybe their jobs are in danger, and then it goes up again, and then it goes up again, right? And the metaphor for this that most people use is that the EU is a bicycle. You may have heard this before, right? The only way the EU survives is if you keep pedaling forward, right? If you stop, fall over, right? So up until now, there haven't been any major examples of policies that have been uploaded to the EU level that were then renationalized and put back into the authority of nation states. Okay, this has generally been a one-directional, one-way uploading of ever more powers that are centralized at the EU level. And because of this, I think Brexit is going to open up the possibility for this kind of renationalization of policies for the following reason. If you see, the Brexit vote as a reaction to all of this EU integration, right? You're going to have voices in other EU member states saying, well, if we don't want this kind of popular revolt against the elites, right, who basically always believed in EU integration, we need to actually repatriate some powers, because otherwise we're going to face something similar that the British government faced, right? So, let's say we're going to need to back off on this whole idea that we need a European asylum policy, because this is what you're seeing in Hungary. Just had a referendum this weekend, right, about how the EU shouldn't be allowed to send asylum seekers to Hungary without the government and the the parliament having its say, right? Or all of these countries are putting up actual borders where they had actually been dismantled, right? So between Austria and Hungary now you have a border. Between Denmark and Germany, you now have a border. There wasn't one for 20 years. So same thing goes for social benefits, right? So David Cameron was trying to negotiate this idea that maybe Poles who work in the UK shouldn't have the same types of social benefits in terms of, money for public housing or unemployment insurance, this kind of stuff that Brits do, right? Just today, apparently, there's been the British government has announced that they want to name and shame companies that employ foreign workers, that every company should disclose what foreign workers they have, right? So, there's a lot of this kind of stuff going on. And so I think Brexit can lead to much more pressure from all of these other member states to repatriate powers to the national governments from the EU, right? Which is, again, sort of going backwards on the bicycle. But third, and I think this is the most important, what you're going to see for the next 2 years is going to be this political theater where you have the UK negotiating against the EU, and the EU is going to drive a hard bargain. And so one interpretation of this is going to be there's this massive behemoth of the EU that is stomping on the sovereign national rights of good old Brits who just want a fair shake, right? And you know where this kind of interpretation is going to be coming from? Well, every single far-right populist anti-European party all over Europe is going to say, this is the real EU. They don't listen to what the people want. They don't care about referenda. They just want to hold on to their power, and they want to punish people for voting their conscience. So Marine Le Pen of the Front National in France is going to say this. Orbán Viktor from Hungary is going to say this. The True Finns are going to say this. Alternative für Deutschland in Germany is going to say this. Every single country has rising far-right populist anti-European parties. And this is going to give them a lot of great material to work with, right? And for 2 years, this is what you're going to read about in the papers when it comes to the EU. The EU is refusing to grant the UK this. The EU is refusing to grant the UK this, right? And so because of that, I think the real fallout of this whole Brexit referendum, and again, this is really ironic, and I'll tell you in a minute why, is that you're going to have a strengthening of these far-right populist anti-European parties in Europe. And the reason this is ironic is because the reason this whole Brexit thing happened is because David Cameron wanted to take the wind out of the sails of UKIP, right, a far-right party, right? The whole reason this whole thing happened is because he wanted to win an election, right? And he wanted to take this issue of anti-Europeanism away from UKIP so that those people would vote Conservative, right? So for that marginal gain, right, we may be seeing a huge political price that the rest of Europe is going to pay. So on that cheery note, I'm going to stop, and then hopefully we'll have a bunch of questions.
All right, well, we've certainly heard a lot about the United Kingdom, and we've heard a lot about the European Union, and especially a lot about Brexit and what it means moving forward. But now it's time for the audience to have their share, so we'll open to a question and answer session. Who wants first dibs? You, sir.
Following on your argument about disintegration, couldn't you put that in the broader context of global disintegration? It's not just in Europe. We see it all around the world in different guises. In fact, if you saw this week's Economist cover story, special issue about is the era of globalization over? Are we backtracking? I just want to get your perspective on it.
Do you want us to collect some, or should I just respond? Up to you.
I think just responding is fine.
I think probably yes. I think there is a general, in a general sense, there has been a lot of weakening of those voices that are able to say, here's why globalization is a positive force, right? And it has to do mostly with the fact that globalization has distributional consequences, right? So like globalization might be great for an economy, but that doesn't matter if you lost your job because of globalization. It just doesn't matter.
Precisely.
Like, and that's what's going to determine your vote, to get back to what we did, right?
Precisely.
So the British economy is probably doing a lot better because EU integration is there and because of globalization, right? But those those workers who who were bypassed by this because now it's Romanian car Romanians who are putting together British cars rather than Brits. They're not going to care
That's
about
what we
that.
call the Polish plumber problem.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that is certainly true. The reason I would think it's a little bit more of a challenge for Europe is that you've had a lot of economic integration around the world. But the European Union was, I think, the pinnacle of the idea that the only way to deal with this kind of economic integration is to also have political integration. And this is how we're going to solve these problems, right? And if you'd asked anybody, even just 10 years ago, they would have said, yeah, the European Union is the future, right? That's where we're going. It makes sense to look at these things globally. If you're thinking about climate change and all these kinds of things, like there's no point in Luxembourg fighting climate change, right? Like Europe has to do it, and then that's going to be the model for how the world should do it in a multilateral way. And I think that's why if the EU starts to disintegrate, then that also sets a precedent for, hey, it's not even worth doing political integration anymore. And that I think would be a real shame because, again, 10 years ago, you still had the African Union modeling itself a little bit on the European Union. You had Mercosur going that way. Everybody was like, oh, this is the future. And if Europe disintegrates, then I think those places are also probably going to turn backwards. Is there?
What do you see the impact being on immigration and the refugee problem if there's increasing discomfort in the EU with having large numbers of refugees and cultural differences and all? Plus you've got Turkey with all its problems right now, and not really certain whether their agreement is going to hold to stop the refugees there, or whether anything can keep large numbers of people from wanting to come out of Africa and go to Europe. So how do you see that fitting?
As a general rule, I think what the EU has been doing, I think to its shame, but that's the opinion part of it, is trying to outsource the problem. Right? So I mean, the Turkey deal is essentially being like, what, if we don't see it, it's not here. Right? And so that deal, I think, had you described this deal 8 years ago, everybody who did EU foreign policy would have said there's no way they're going to make that deal. I mean, Turkey is clearly, especially right now, post-coup, violates so many human rights and other fundamental principles of the EU that they're not going to make that deal. Well, made the deal. Same thing goes for, the hard borders that were built up, right? I mean, Hungary built this fence with the Serbian border, so now the asylum seekers are not in Hungary, they're on, 20 feet away in Serbia, right? But now it's Serbia's problem, right? So I think what you're seeing is, you're just trying to push off the problem somewhere else. I don't see right now any political will on the side of leaders in Europe to take in more refugees or to deal with this. The one thing I would say though is that this was especially galling in the Brexit debate, right? Because so few refugees actually made it to the UK, right? Because it's just far away, right? So they had so many obstacles on the way that this whole sort of we want to keep the immigrants out rhetoric in the UK during the Brexit was actually, I think Harold can tell you much more about it, but it's really interesting because the immigrants they talked about were at times basically the Poles that took their jobs, which is one type of immigrant. Then it was the immigrants from sort of the rest of the Commonwealth, which has nothing to do with the EU, right? So they're coming from especially from South Asia, right? And then there's this asylum thing, and everything was rolled into one. So I don't know if you have some.
Yeah, one of the things that's striking, as I said at the end of my remarks, is how negative opinion is, not just in Britain, which we know abundantly, and it's not new, but in France and Germany. The distribution of opinion on our standard immigration question is almost identical. And it's really struck me. I was really surprised. This is a survey we just did 2 weeks ago in Germany and France, of course, which are major key players in the EU. And so there are major elections coming up in both of those countries this year. Both of those countries have right-wing populist parties that are doing quite or very well. Quite well in the German case, very well in the French case. So I do not, I think you're absolutely right. There is not going to be any move to try to deal with the refugee crisis in a what many people would consider a humane way over, at least until those elections are passed. I mean, those are the key players in the EU, and so you are not going to see any pro-refugee or pro-immigrant kinds of policy initiatives in the EU or in those countries in the next year. In the British case, I think it is a given that any policy, immigration part of a Brexit deal must. Any Conservative Party which gave up on this point about a free movement of labor now would be trashed forever. The Tories would be trashed, I think, forever. So you're going to see probably this hard Brexit, which you described, with all the possibly negative ensuing economic consequences and so forth, for the reasons you described very well, is a very likely scenario to me. I'm very bearish about the nature of the kind of deal that's going to be struck. And note also that the British party system, more generally, is in considerable disarray. And it's not just now. The Labour Party just had a big internal battle about keeping their leader, who is, I think, in truth, is quite Eurosceptic himself. Although he says he's not, I think he, in his heart, he is. So there are divisions there still in the Labour Party. The hard left in Labour still is much more Eurosceptic than you might at first imagine, for reasons, sort of historical reasons within the British Labour Party. So I'm pessimistic.
Do you see a possible alternative being discussed in Europe to look for some other solution for the immigration problem, like dealing with problems where they are in Africa, in the countries that are at war or famine or having problems, or something that doesn't involve an open border and huge influx of refugees?
I mean, I think so, but the problem is that is needed in order not to have a huge refugee flow in 10 years. If you have right now a very well thought out, smart policy of the EU towards, let's say, sub-Saharan Africa, that might mean that in 10 years you don't get 1 million South Sudanese coming in. It doesn't help at all with the current crisis, right? There's nothing you can do that's going to make somebody want to live in Libya in the next 10 years, or Syria, right? It's just, I just don't think there's nothing the EU can do. They can't just build a functioning state in these places. So I think the problem is they're not even thinking about that, which means this refugee crisis isn't going to end with Syria, right? Yemen's about to fall apart, right? South Sudan and Sudan might be going to war anytime. It's sort of touch and go, right? There's all these conflict zones from which now one of the main ways of escape is to migrate out. And so I think hopefully, yes, there will be some sort of EU reaction and say, no, we need to nip this in the bud, but that nips the stuff in the bud for the next 10 years, not the current stuff. So I think it's kind of like, when you're fighting a fire, you want to put out the fire, but you need to make sure that the buildings next door don't burn down either. And so I think those are two different issues.
I'm very bearish both on the refugee crisis and as well, and the larger point about designing policy initiatives that would be beneficial either for immigration or the refugee crisis in particular. I think you're absolutely right.
Over here.
Aren't there lessons that we in the United States can draw from what's happened there? Farage has made some comments relating to the Trump campaign and the issues that are revolving there as having a great deal of parallels to what happened in Britain and leaving Brexit. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm hoping to go back and see Nigel. I had lunch with Nigel Farage last year. We did a big study of the UKIP party members, and they actually gave us the membership list, and we interviewed 15,000 of them. And in return for this, we had to do a presentation to them. And then I got to get a chance to have lunch with him. And I'd love to go back and talk to him about exactly what what he's talking about here. But clearly we can see that the American, that we do have some echoes here in this present campaign. There's no question about it. Immigration is a huge issue in this election. There's no doubt about it. And many of the sentiments that immigration that stimulates that debate are parallel to what we see in our UK work. So I think you're absolutely right on this. As I say, Farage is not somebody I would, though, if I was Donald Trump, would get too close to. He's got his supporters, but he's got a lot more. He walks into a room, he'll get some supporters, but he'll also get some opponents very quickly. One thing about UKIP, for some of you, some people have actually called Donald Trump Adolf Hitler. He's Hitler. Well, they did the same thing in the UK with Farage. But that's really a misnomer. The UKIP party is not the BNP. It's not a street fighting party of young yobs, as the Brits say.
Somebody was fighting yesterday.
Well, UKIP though, but is not. UKIP is basically a bunch of old guys. Okay, 83%. The mean age is 65 in their membership. 65. 83% male. 83%, okay? So these are a bunch of old guys grumbling in their pubs out there in East Anglia, When I go out there and stay in beautiful Boxford, there's all these UKIP signs around and so forth. These guys, don't mistake them, They're nostalgic for a past, for a UK that they may have fought for, some of them even in earlier wars, or certainly their parents did. That's UKIP. They're the politics of political nostalgia, really, and so forth. Not to say they don't stimulate emotions, but don't mistake them for some sort of like street fighting, like a 25-year-old or something like this. That's not who they are. That was the BNP, and they're largely gone by the by. And by the way, when you're over there, one of the things you always want to watch for if you're going to go into a pub is whether they're flying the flag of St. George or not. If they are, it's dicey. It's dicey. I've been with my friends. We want to go in and watch a football game on a Sunday afternoon, and we're not quite sure, whether we should go in there or not. But go a little further out in the country and get to one of these polite, it's nice polite places out like Stoke by Nayland or something like this, and that's who the UKippers are. They're not kids. They're not toughs. They're people who are older folks thinking of a Britain that, was, it's big and hill. It's the Battle of Britain. That's, and I'll say frankly, one of the things that is about the EU, a lot of Brits, when they say the EU, they think of Germany. They think of Germany. And Germany, of course, is enormously powerful politically and economically in the EU. And of course, over the last 4 or 5 years, first with the Eurozone crisis, and then secondly, more recently with the refugee crisis, Germany has just been all over, like EU equals Germany, EU equals Germany. And that does not play well with a lot of Brits. It's this emotional, cultural sort of background, especially for these older guys.
Yeah, and just to add two things, so I think it's true, it's the sort of get off my lawn demographic, right, is UKIP. And Germany in the UK plays a big role in defining, UK nationalism, right? Because that's the sort of latest huge, sort of, as an island nation, who are they an island from? Not Europe, but Germany, right? So I think that's true. The one other thing I would say is in terms of lessons learned, right, for the US. One thing I would get back to is the role of the media, and I think one lesson that might be important here is that you cannot have a functioning democracy if somehow your media landscape is unable to weed out truth from lies. And that, I think, is something that in 5 years people are going to be writing about. Comparative, not that the media landscape is comparable in the US to the UK, they're very different, but I think the fact that that political campaigns can generate their own facts now, that I think is something that really is at the heart of both the Brexit and the current issues also in the US. And that I think might be something that Not that I know how to fix it. If I did, I'd be, giving speeches for a lot more money somewhere else. But but in terms of, so I don't know what the lesson is, but I think that's a commonality that is important.
Yeah,
Social media play a big part.
not with these guys. They wouldn't know what a they wouldn't know.
It's really the dailies. I mean, if you look at sort of how many daily print newspapers are sold in the UK versus France, it's a
amazing.
factor of 10 difference. Right? Nobody in France buys a newspaper. It's only the elites. The way it's written, you can only read it if you are of that persuasion. Right? Germany, same thing. Right? There they have some more sort of regional ones that do a little better. Right? But in Britain, everybody actually reads a paper, and so, or at least subscribes to one, right? So they sell enough, and that I think is a big difference. I don't think it's mostly social media.
One of the things to note, though, like keep thinking of Fox News over here, or the Daily Mail, or the Sun. That thing I had, was it Boris what done it? I mean, that is from the Sun. That is from the 1997 claim by the Sun the day after the Labour Party under Tony Blair won this huge majority. They said themselves, self-congratulations. It was the Sun what done it. Okay, so you're absolutely right. The press is highly partisan in Britain, highly politicized, has been, and the good news is everybody knows it. That's the other side of it. Whereas here, of course, there's still the pretense that it's not, and I would argue that it's very much a pretense. But that's another topic. The thing to note, though, is the press is not always like take the Daily Mail is a good example, and the Mail on Sunday. I know a little bit about them. We used to do survey work for the Mail on Sunday, and during the 2015 election, so those guys, they really supported Brexit, a few months ago. They must have supported UKIP during the 2015 election. No, they trashed UKIP. They trashed UKIP and supported David Cameron. Why? Because Murdoch said this is what they should do. But it's a little more nuanced. You have to be a little careful with it. But clearly, you're absolutely right. During the Brexit debate, the popular press, which gets 95% of the readership, the Sun, the Daily Mail, the Express, those guys are all get out, get out, get out. And then the quality press, the Times, the Independent, the Guardian, which gets 4 or 5% collectively, are all wringing their hands. Oh, this is terrible. Oh my goodness. And of course the day after, as I said, all the elites, all the polite companies, such as would assemble in a room like this, just absolutely trash the electorate. People who I'd read they're great Democrats and so on. No, they're not such great Democrats if the people don't vote the way you want them to vote. Oh, they're fools, they're idiots. And the Leave campaigners are all liars. Now, they may well have been. They may well have been. And there's a lot of debate about the economics, like the balance sheet, the battle of the balance sheet. But no, the role of the press is really interesting in Britain, and it's certainly worth understanding. Now, how do people get this information, quote unquote? Well, in many cases, like you said, they get it through the press. Now, this is not true of the electronic media, by the way. The electronic media in Britain are under much heavier restrictions in terms of what they do politically. They can't run ads. You can't go over and buy an ad you get Nigel Farage. So, let's do a media buy. I'll get my buddy Aaron Banks, who's the Koch brother of the UK. This guy who funds UKIP, basically, this billionaire. Well, I'll get Aaron to run a bunch of anti-EU ads for us. We got a vote coming up in a couple weeks. Can't do it. Not like here, where we see the campaigns. You got money, you can do a buy here. Citizens United, as we all know. Not over there. It's not like that at all. So it's the print media. And of course, there are some people, despite what I said about those old UKIPers, there are lots of younger people, of course, who read their print media, quote unquote, on their tablets and computers and cell phones as well.
You, sir?
So, looking forward, let's say this just completely blows up in the UK's face. I mean, the worst decision they made in the history of their existence. Say 10, 12 years down the road, they
let go of the colonies.
I think the Raj may have been. say down the road, they say, oh my God, we got to get back in. One, would the EU even let them back? And two, how far would the proverbial barrel barrel would they have to go to be allowed back in? Essentially, just how many sanctions would the EU say you're going to take it, and we're going to put these sanctions on you if you want to come back?
I mean, I don't think it's going to be so let me put it this way. I think politically, for the UK government to say, oh, now we're going to want to play backsies, I don't think that can happen within the next generation, just because you have to respect the fact that you had a referendum and that that's what the people want. So if you were to do that, you would have to say, oh, all of you voters were wrong, right? And therefore we're gonna, so no, I don't think, from the UK side, it would be very hard for a government to do it. From the EU side, there's two things. I think, legally speaking, the only thing that the EU could do is say, you know what, you need to go through the exact same process that everybody else would need to go through. Which means actually that the UK would get back in and lose a lot of the special deals it has now. Because right now the UK has a bunch of special deals. And a lot of those might be an even more problematic deal breaker for the UK. So if the UK were to reapply in 5 years, they would have to take on the euro, they would have to become part of Schengen, right? So all the things that they're
Not gonna happen.
So I just don't think it's gonna happen. I think if they're out for good. And I also don't really see any urgency on the part of the EU to say, oh, let's get you back in the fold. So I think if they actually leave, it's it's for at least the next, I would say roughly a generation, so like 20-25 years. And this is actually why when my students asked me a couple of months ago, like, what's going to happen, I was like, oh, don't worry about it. I don't think Theresa May is going to be stupid enough to set a date and actually start negotiations for withdrawal, because she knows she's going to go down as that prime minister in history who took Britain out of the EU, and she did anyway. So it shows you, first of all, how much experts know, but also,
Theresa May is famous for saying nothing, and when she speaks, for saying nothing. So she said Brexit means Brexit. Well, what does Brexit mean? My view, which I think we share, is Brexit. Brexit means hard Brexit. And the EU, it's a ratchet. You talk about the EU ratchet, which you spoke about earlier, always upward and onward, or you'll fall off the bike. I think now the UK is going out. It's going out hard, and they can't cut a deal. Politically, they cannot cut the deal, the Norway deal. They can. The key thing is the free movement of labor. That is the key thing that no British government, particularly Theresa May, can give way on. The Tory Party, after all, we had a majority. We had a majority of a pretty large turnout voted to leave. A lot of those people are conservatives or UKIPers. The future of not just Theresa May, but the Conservative Party is really bound up with moving ahead with Brexit. They don't really dare not Brexit. And they can't, and they won't come back either. Now, as a tourist, you may have noticed the pound crash yesterday, and I'm saying, oh, this is wonderful. I'm going over there in a few weeks. This is fantastic. It's an ill wind doesn't blow somebody good. But no, my opinion is, I'm quite bearish on the prospects of going back.
Just, I guess, as a quick follow-up, do you believe they would try to have other nations leave as well? Maybe France and Germany say, you know what? You guys should leave too. You're having the migrant crisis. You're having all this thing.
That's right.
Yeah, it's almost. We'll stick it to the EU together, guys. Let's all go start our own club. Sort of an issue.
The one thing I would say is, and I noticed this a lot in the European Parliament, where you had all of these far-right parties, right? And in order to have any institutional power within the institution, they would have had to cooperate. And it was always really tricky,
Yeah,
right? So they formed these political groups, then those splintered immediately, right? And the reason for that, as I like to think about it, is that the rallying cry, xenophobes of the world unite, right? Like, there's something that rings untrue about it, right? So getting a bunch of hardcore nationalists, right, together to cooperate on something is really difficult. No, but this is a serious answer to your question, right? So I think, having some sort of, all these far-right parties, pushing against the EU and wanting to leave, right? The leaving part is okay, but they're not going to form their own club, and then they have.
No, they don't want
they're just
clubs.
back to it, right?
They don't want clubs.
And so, what I think is going to be a slightly more plausible alternative is that those countries that are the exact opposite. So the ones that really still think that EU integration is a good thing, they're going to form a hardcore of sort of an EU plus. Don't let in any of these dirty Eastern Europeans who are racists and who, just constantly make trouble. Don't let in any of these Southern Europeans who can't, keep clean books. Don't let in any of these, island people who just don't know what they're doing, right? So the sort of core, France, Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, back to the original idea.
Original European.
So what I think you might have
community.
is this integration of the EU in the sense that, you start to get a hardcore that pushes ahead with political integration and leaves everybody else behind. And by the way, that's where the money is. So it's going to be interesting, right? And then everybody else is in sort of a more loosey-goosey EU with some repatriation of powers, but then also none of these structural funds, which is essentially what's keeping Eastern Europe alive right now. None of these, essentially, the euro, which is creating fiscal stability for all these countries that are way too small otherwise to have it. So I think that's more likely. Instead of having others fall away, it's essentially the same picture, but it works out a different way. You have a core that comes together much more.
They're not leaving, they're being left, essentially.
Yes, good way to put it. Yeah.
The economics of the European Union are really interesting because it seems to be pretty obvious for a lot of these smaller Eastern European countries, the EU is like a really good deal economically. This makes lots of sense. We're going to be able to have a standard of living. We may have to, what you're, giving up. Who cares about sovereignty? Who cares about this or that democracy? This is the only way that we can have a Western, quote unquote, standard of living, in the foreseeable future. At all, coming off, decades of devastation under communist rule. Okay, and that's a powerful argument for the EU. And as far as Germany is concerned, that's okay. They're small. We've got markets there. We can do lots of good business. And with troublesome little countries like Greece, they basically bought Greece. This is, you can actually deal another bailout with Greece and say, oh yeah, well they're going to here's a piece of paper they say they're going to pay. It doesn't matter whether they do or don't. They're too small. And so what you wanted to do was to get beyond that because of the threat of Brexit's coming up. And that's fine with little countries like that. The tough countries, though, would be countries like Spain and Italy. They're too big. You can't buy Spain and Italy. That's right, exactly. Or even Poland, which is an Eastern European country, but a big one. And those present bigger problems for this core group, like you said. These countries present harder problems going forward economically, in terms of the economics of the EU, in my judgment. I'm not an economist, but it seems pretty clear that that's the way it is.
You think Scotland will twist off?
It's interesting now. See, if you think about the strategy of campaigning in the Brexit referendum, there are two players there. One is our friend Jeremy Corbyn, the head of the Labour Party, and the second is Nicola Sturgeon, the head of the SNP in Scotland, the governing SNP in Scotland. Now, both of these people are leading parties, political movements that are ostensibly in favor of a Remain majority, because Scotland, of course, if they were independent, they're one of these little guys like Greece. They really, and like some of these smaller Eastern European countries, they really need the EU, or like Ireland is maybe a canonical example. But if you're thinking strategically, in terms of your future, what you may want to do is destroy the Conservative Party. How do I destroy the Conservative Party? I have a Leave majority. That's what I want. I got a governing Prime Minister leading a small majority. I want him defeated. And then we're going to divide, because of Brexit will divide the Conservatives perhaps permanently. This will open the door then, and will boost these Brexit negotiations, will boost sentiment for Scottish independence. So what happens in Scotland? You got Nicola Sturgeon say, oh yeah, Remain, but she does virtually nothing. She doesn't campaign hard. And I think it was a strategic decision, because she judged that the best chance of ever getting Scottish independence was to have a Leave majority, and then a hard Brexit, Conservative Party falls apart, we win. We can win then a Scottish referendum. I think that's her calculation. And I think, quite honestly, people have given Jeremy Corbyn not enough credit. I think that was his calculation too. You know, if Labour's ever going to get in power, they got to destroy the Conservatives now. They got to cut them right apart.
If Scotland leaves, they're taking most of the Liberal vote with them that Labour relies on, because it's coming from Scotland.
That's right. But Corbyn may well have judged that it's gone already, because in the last election we had this huge move to the SNP. Now, and that move by itself, and you're absolutely right, was enough to deny the Labour Party any chance in 2015 of forming a plurality and hence having the opportunity to do a coalition government. To be sure, you're absolutely right. But I think they may figure that that's gone anyway, that they're going to have to, their game has to be a different game, and that, to get a few more Scottish seats, but they're not going to go back to being the Clydeside-like dominant Labour Party in Scotland that they were for decades. They may have concluded that ain't there. It just is not. But certainly for Nicola Sturgeon, you could well imagine her making this calculation, sort of lukewarm Remain in public, and then hoping it goes down. This will give me the extra 10% I need to win the next referendum. And I wouldn't be surprised if that was her calculation. I'm not privy to it, but it made sense to me. If she'd asked me, I said, that's exactly what it did.
So from the EU side, what I think is interesting is I think Nicola Sturgeon might very well argue, because we were forced to leave the EU against our will as Scots, we should have a chance to get in.
Exactly.
The problem is, I see no chance whatsoever in the next 30 years of Scotland being let into the EU. And this is because of certain member states that will do everything in their power to make sure that no secessionist political movements in Europe are ever successful. So the Spanish with the Basque and the Catalans, the Slovakians and the Romanians with Hungarians, the Cypriots because they're Cypriots.
France too.
France, I think, France is probably a little bit. France, I think, could be moved on it, but these countries for sure cannot be, right? So this is the reason that these are the countries that haven't recognized Kosovo. They are not going. I'm not even sure they recognize Scotland, to be quite honest. No, I'm not kidding. These are huge domestic political hot potatoes that they don't want to touch. So if Scotland is allowed to have a referendum, become independent, and become part of the EU, that's what Catalonia is going to go, right? So Spain cannot let that precedent sit. So I don't think the EU is going to allow Scotland to become an EU member state in this sense. And I think they're going to be very clear about it.
You think they'd say up front, we won't allow this?
The Spanish Prime Minister already sort of hinted at this during the Scottish referendum and during the Brexit referendum when it looked like it was going to get close and Nicola Sturgeon was like, whoa, then we'll just hold another referendum. And the Spanish Prime Minister was like, by the way, we're going to veto that just so.
Does it have to be unanimous to
Yes.
get in?
Yeah.
Every single member state needs. So that's 4 to 5 potential vetoes, and you only need 1.
Yeah, it's a Polish veto.
So I think it's very, very unlikely for that reason.
It's very interesting.
Well-
I'm interested in, may I ask one question?
Of course.
I'm interested in the demographics in terms of support for far-right parties in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
It was interesting for me to hear you differentiate the BNP from UKIP. That was something I had known. And then you think about the fact that most of the younger generation supported Remain.
Mm-hmm.
And then you think about how in this country, if a comparison may be drawn, the millennials by and large reject Trump's nativism.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious to know whether the far-right parties in Europe have similar demographic divisions, or are they quite different?
I don't know yet a lot about that. We're doing some work right now, as I said, but generally, I think your generalization is right. That younger people tend to be more internationalist, and in the European context, more pro-EU. In the American context, more pro-immigration, more internationalist, and so forth. I think you're right. And as I said, one of the things that's really interesting, though, is all that granted, is I was struck by the strength of anti-immigrant sentiment in these recent, high-quality, surveys that we've done, national surveys in both France and in Germany. You don't need young people; you just need voters. Lots of voters. If they're young or old, I'm quite happy to. It doesn't matter. I want your vote, and so it's going to be really fascinating to see these elections in France and Germany next year. The thing it's a remarkable amount is in this press over here and commentary, confusion between UKIP and parties like BNP or the English Defence League and so forth. These are very different demographics and very different beliefs too. The UKIPers don't believe, they're not politically violent at all. They're ballots, not bullets. They're too old to fight. These guys, but they're not like that. If they think of fighting, they would think of themselves or probably their parents fighting in World War II is what they really think about. No, these guys are very democratic, and one of the things they'll talk about too, one of their beefs with the EU is what's called the democratic deficit. It really doesn't matter, even if the EU became very democratic, which arguably it certainly is not. Great Britain, the UK, would still just be a small fraction. They would be what? I don't know. They wouldn't even be Florida to the analog. And so they really are giving up sovereignty. The EU, this ratchet that we mentioned before, is a real thing. It's a real thing. And if you don't buy into that, it's really hard to be a EU supporter. This is not just a common market. Far from it. So you're making a big political and cultural commitment if you buy into the EU. Young people say they're ready to do it. Certainly the older voters are not.
I'm also unsure. It's a really good question, and I don't know much about sort of the polling in other countries. Just because I have family there, I know a little bit about Hungary. And there, what's interesting is that in recent polls, the most popular party among college students, so not college graduates, college students, was Jobbik, which is the real fascists.
Yeah, those are the hardcore guys.
That's the equivalent of the BNP.
Yeah, that's the BNP. The difference is they're a much more powerful group.
Yeah, right. But they have the same number of supporters as in terms of percentage of the population as UKIP does, right? So I don't think it's a straight corollary between age. I think it also has to do with how much do you feel part of this whole European project? So for instance, this probably has, what I imagine this would map onto is foreign language skills. Travel, this kind of stuff, right? So all those Erasmus students, the sort of university students who get to spend a semester abroad somewhere in Europe, right? That's the core of those people who are really into the EU, like it, understand it. A lot of them, because that's when they traveled, right? Your age, right? That's where they meet their significant others, right? There's a great sort of Facebook meme that went around that the commission, I don't know how they calculated this, right? But they said they were celebrating the 1 millionth Erasmus baby, right? So the 1 millionth baby that was born to people who met on an Erasmus, right? Study abroad project, right? Stuff like that. If, on the other hand, and this is actually what, in this sense, the UK and Hungary are similar, where the population doesn't speak foreign languages, then I think the youth, whether you're young or not, is maybe not as indicative. So I think it's an open question, but it's not necessarily just that the young people are pro-European and the old are not. I think it's a bit more complicated.
Yeah, and we have done a little bit of work. A little bit of work on this. You're absolutely right. The demographic correlates, for example, for support for the National Front are quite different from the demographics for support for the Conservatives, or UKIP in particular, in the UK. We can at least say that. But to get into details, got to do a little more work on that.
Well, we've talked a lot about Brexit, we've talked a lot about the EU and jumped around countries, but unfortunately we will not solve all these issues today. So we're going to have to end our discussion here, but thank you all for coming.
Yes, thank you.